What is the crack, everyone? It is Nathan here, aka the Rambling Kern, and head instructor of Kern School of Combat. A recent question came up at the end of one of my previous videos, and this may end up being two separate videos, but I kind of wanted to dive into the reasons why most people have not heard about Irish martial arts. So, this is quite a multifaceted thing, and there's a lot of very nuanced points to this that people outside of Ireland might not necessarily understand and might not necessarily know much about. I will probably do another video as to why Irish martial arts declined. But this video will have some overlap, so if you're interested in the second one, let me know in the comments, and I'm more than happy to do that. So there is a multitude of reasons as to why these arts disappeared, and probably best to start out kind of chronologically. So one of the biggest reasons would be the famine. So you had the population of Ireland almost halved, and many of the arts, especially when it comes to faction fights of that time, were practiced by poorer people, let's say. And as a result, often these arts slowly declined, mainly because the knowledge was not retained. So that was a huge reason as to why that happened, and as to why the arts did decline in the way that they did. You had a lot of people who were struggling to survive, and as a result, sports such as cultural wrestling tended to decline, but also a lot of the people who would have practiced, say, Irish stick fighting were no longer either in the country, they immigrated, or may have sadly passed, as many people did during the famine. So that is kind of one aspect of it. Another one is, without to make this political, my channel is not in any way political, but it is the truth of the matter, colonialism did have a huge impact on especially Irish martial pursuits. And I say that because also when it comes to wrestling and certain activities like that, these things were kind of frowned upon. Anyone who's familiar with boxing and the history of boxing will kind of understand that even in England, boxing was quite negatively viewed upon for quite a long time. And with time that view did eventually change, but it was in no way different when it came to wrestling and other similar arts. However, there are references to collar and elbow especially being quite a bit more palatable because it wasn't as bloody as say boxing was. Now obviously when it comes to colonialism, and the penal laws played a big role in Irish people not possessing weapons, and that would have also played a big role in people not practicing weapons openly. So people practicing Ballarat and practicing stick fighting or Irish stick fighting would not have been able to do it very openly, and as a result a lot of people try to distance themselves from it because it was essentially a criminal pursuit. While it was for many a form of self-protection and self-defense, it was very much viewed by the powers that be as a form of illegal activity. I mean, it would be very, very much frowned upon. So the aspects of colonialism run very deep when it comes to Irish martial arts, and I think it's very important to understand how that aspect has impacted Irish culture. And I think for a lot of people outside of Ireland who romanticize certain aspects of Irish culture, they kind of miss out on this. So for an example of the time of faction fighting, what we would normally see today of how a leprechaun is dressed is actually much more akin to how people of that time would have dressed. As you'd see in the likes of British Punch cartoons, Irish people were very much portrayed in a very negative light. As is often the way with any sort of colonial power, with those that they're trying to control, they're just viewed this way. So the imagery and the culture around martial arts in Ireland were very much frowned upon, and as a result that negative stereotype crossed into Irish culture. And you can very much see that by how Irish people view certain things, such as the kind of leprechaunization, let's say, of Irish history and Irish people and Irish culture. And this very much happens for no fault of their own, but certain people, especially in the Irish stick fighting community, choose to dress a certain way and depict themselves in a certain way, almost Peaky Blinder-esque, which, as I say, is not really how people of the time of faction fights were dressing. And it's not really in any way reflective of Irish culture. If you watch my previous video on what is traditional Irish clothing, those items are very much not traditional Irish clothing, and as a result, that negative stereotype is still viewed by many Irish people. Not all by any means, and I know for many people that portrayal is done with the best intentions and out of kindness and respect for Ireland, but it is worth noting that in many ways that is a negative stereotype created about Ireland, and many people in Ireland especially try to distance themselves from that. The stereotype of the fighting Irish and those similar aspects are something that many Irish people have tried to distance themselves from, and it is something that culturally Irish people really are uncomfortable with in many ways and have tried to distance themselves from. And that's a big part of why I've created this channel and why I'm having these discussions with you, because I think these are very important aspects of our culture that we've lost, especially when it comes to our martial culture. And for many reasons, Irish people have tried to distance themselves from that because we were being portrayed in a very negative, uneducated way. And we are not that country. We have never been that country or those people. But it is important to kind of understand that cultural aspect when it comes to trying to understand the Irish martial arts. The other things that kind of play into this as well is, as part of that, literacy was quite low. So you're not going to find written texts. You're not going to find books. You may find diaries, especially when it comes to the topics of some of my previous videos on the National Folklore Archive. That was a group of people who understood what this meant. So if you listened to my video on that with the audio recording, you will see that people did know that Irish stick fighting was being done and being practiced, and they did understand that. But they didn't have any urgency to preserve it because it was just something that happened and there was no cultural link to it. And as a result, the arts didn't really survive in the way that many other arts did, and they began to decline. And you can see this globally across many different weapon arts. They just generally are not as popular. And that leads me on to the next point, is that sportification of martial pursuits is what helped many to be preserved. So wrestling is a perfect example, and boxing is a perfect example. These had many martial applications and were often trained by soldiers, and was formed as self-defense, but sport is really what brought them to the forefront and helped them survive. And collar and elbow to a point did get there, but then the art itself just began to decline for other arts that were more popular. And stick fighting is the same. Obviously, this was done through necessity more so, and was very much a martial pursuit and a martial art in its own right, but as a result, it began to decline and was not preserved. Because it was not able to really be transferred into the realm of sport. Another aspect, and the next point, is the church. I know this is very well known internationally that Ireland is a very religious country, maybe less so in recent years, but especially at the turn of the 1900s, Ireland was a very religious country. And from reading extracts and reading first-hand accounts, I know that the church played a big impact on trying to help Irish people to be viewed in a less violent way, and also to be a more peaceful and Christian society. That's what the church did. So many martial pursuits, having only discussed this with someone recently, whose father in the 50s would have practiced in school, wrestling. Some from a back hold, he didn't have a term for it at the time, but most likely coming from a longer lineage, and that art was basically lost and gone because the local priest didn't want something so violent being practiced. These are these sort of cultural things that can play a big role in these sort of arts declining. Another one, which may surprise some people, is the GAA. So I'm going to bring up on screen now a first-hand account from the archives of how the GAA helped faction fights to decline. The match would generally wind up with a fight, but when the GAA was started and strict rules were enforced, all that disappeared. It was the GAA, more than anything else that I know of, that helped most to put an end to the faction fighting. So, this is an interesting little excerpt for many reasons. Most of all because it gives a very interesting insight into how organised sport began to put a decline into these more violent pursuits. As is often the way when sports get more organised and rules become commonplace, obviously the violent aspects are removed for safer practice for those involved. But for many people, when hurling was first started, from some of the accounts that I've read, it was much more of a unorganised sport and often ended or began with brawls. So very understandable that the sport was streamlined in the way that it was, rules were introduced, and now we have the amazing sport that we do. But as a result, many of those martial pursuits were taken out and removed. And this kind of brings me on to my final and arguably kind of one of the more important points, which I think is almost a video topic in itself, is that for many people, Irish stick fighting especially, and perhaps even in collar and elbow, they are not the martial arts that we think of as martial arts. So what I mean by that is, in a modern context, and this is where I feel many aspects of Irish martial arts and Irish martial culture have been lost, is that for many people, if you were to talk to an older generation in Ireland and ask them what is a martial art, to you they would probably recount something that they've seen, say karate or taekwondo, something with a belt where you practice in a dojo, or a dedicated training space with a uniform, has a curriculum, has a set of rules, and that's that. Whereas if you listen to the audio account of Irish stick fighting that I gave, that was a first-hand account of someone who witnessed it and was just, oh yeah, they practice with sticks. And it's actually amazed me over the years how many people have brought that up, whether they knew of someone or they heard of a father or a grandfather or a relative who had practiced some form of Irish stick fighting but didn't view it as a martial art. To them it was not a martial art because a martial art is this specific thing. And that's where this stuff gets very interesting. So many people, actually, even people who follow this channel, I know, who have discussed where their father, uncle, or other relative may have practiced boxing. They didn't necessarily call it boxing, but they showed them how to throw some punches and to defend for themselves. But that was them teaching them boxing. And it's very much the same with Irish martial arts, that these arts were not preserved because they were not viewed as arts. They were just something you did. It was just something you practiced. And I feel many of these arts have been lost because of that, because they're not viewed for what they are, and there's no effort to preserve them because of that. Now, I know this was a bit of a long-winded and somewhat of a rambling video, but I hope it kind of gives you a bit of a brief insight into some of the reasons as to why you may not be as familiar with Irish martial arts as you should. Now, all of these various things kind of compounded to slowly phase the art out, or the arts I should say. But there's a lot of very specific reasons as to why the arts declined, and I mean, if people are interested, I'm more than happy to do another video on that. But this is to kind of give you a few reasons as to why you may not have heard of these arts. And one of the biggest reasons why these arts have survived is due to the Irish diaspora. In other words, the Irish people who emigrated and did their best to preserve Irish culture when they went abroad. And that's where most of these arts have survived. And if anyone is dubious of this, please go and look at any traditional Irish music, and you'll see a wealth of that was preserved in America and Canada and various other parts of the world where the Irish went to. It was very much the same with Irish martial culture, because this was for many of these people, how they defended themselves. So it's almost more common for people abroad to refer to these arts than it is in Ireland, because it's not something here that you'd really come across, and culturally I feel many of these arts don't necessarily have an identity just yet. So I'd really like to thank you for watching this video. I do really appreciate it. As I say, there is more to this topic, and it is one that I could talk about for quite a long time. I feel there's not many Irish people practicing these arts, and there's not many people who understand them from a cultural perspective, especially people outside of Ireland who practice and love these arts. They don't necessarily understand some of the nuances that Irish people feel and face towards them. So I think it's kind of an important little discussion to have, and just an important thing to kind of consider when we discuss these arts and work to portray them to the greater world. And there is certain aspects of Irish culture that people don't necessarily understand, because they're quite complex and have quite a long history to them. So anyway, if you're interested in any follow-up videos on this topic, please let me know. I'm working on some very interesting stuff at the moment, so please like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. It really does help the channel, and I really appreciate you watching. So thanks once again, and slán.